So, ever wonder how browsers know exactly how to display a web page? I mean, you type in a URL, and bam, in mere milliseconds, a blank screen transforms into this rich, fully structured environment. It happens literally in the blink of an eye. But underneath all that rapid rendering, there's a highly specific set of instructions driving the entire experience. Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into the absolute bedrock of the internet, HTML. Even if you already know the basics, taking a closer look at this ultimate blueprint of the web gives us a totally renewed appreciation for how our digital world is put together. Let's decode the architecture that powers, well, everything we see online. Here's our agenda for today. First, we'll answer what is HTML. Second, we'll look at the anatomy of a web page. Third, we're going to understand HTML elements. And finally, we'll wrap up with the history of HTML. Okay, let's dive right into section 1. What is HTML? So, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And at its core, it's the universal standard used for creating web pages. The absolute key word here is standard. You see, back in the early days of computing, we were honestly on the brink of a deeply fragmented ecosystem. Every network or operating system could have easily required its own proprietary format just to display a document. But a universal markup language completely changed the trajectory of the internet. It gave us a shared set of structural elements that any browser, anywhere in the world, could parse and understand. This standardization is exactly what prevented a fragmented mess and allowed the web to scale into the massive, globally connected network we rely on today. Now, the easiest way to wrap your head around HTML isn't to think of it as some crazy complex programming language, but rather like a super precise, high-tech label maker. When you write HTML, you're essentially just taking raw content and slapping a structural label right on it. You're marking up the text to give it distinct meaning. By explicitly declaring, hey, this is a heading, or this is a hyperlink, you're handing the browser the exact metadata it needs to build the page. Without these specific labels, the browser would just see a massive, unstructured wall of text, completely unable to tell a primary navigation bar from a tiny footnote at the bottom. Moving right along to section 2, Anatomy of a Web Page. Take a look at this basic HTML document structure. Now, you might already be familiar with some of these tags, but using this exact setup as our map reveals exactly how a page is constructed from top to bottom. It lays out the foundational hierarchy that has to be there before a single pixel is ever rendered on your screen. The whole architecture of a web page relies entirely on this nesting sequence. It establishes really clear parent and child relationships that basically dictate how everything behaves within the browser. And what's really interesting here is that every single one of these tags has a highly specific job to do. I mean, absolutely nothing is here by accident. The browser reads this document sequentially, using these nested elements to build out the page you actually see. When the rendering engine hits this code, it processes that hierarchy to figure out what goes on the visible canvas and what stays tucked away behind the scenes as metadata. Understanding this strict step-by-step parsing is crucial because, honestly, even one misplaced tag can completely wreck the structural integrity of your final page. Let's break down what these essential tags are actually doing. All right, let's take this step by step. Up at the very top, we've got the exclamation point DOCTY HTML declaration. This is an absolutely critical instruction. It basically tells the browser, loud and clear, that it's dealing with a modern HTML5 document. Without this, older browsers can actually panic and fall back into something developers call Quirks mode. That's where they try to emulate the super messy, non-standard behavior of late 90s browsers, which leads to incredibly broken layouts. So DOCTY sets the rules of engagement. Next up is the root element, which is simply called HTML. Literally everything else on the page lives inside this root. Following that is the head element. Think of this as a container for meta information, stuff you mostly don't see directly on the page, like character sets, external style sheets, and the title element, which controls the text you see up in your browser's tab. Right after the head comes the body, and the body element is the ultimate container for all the visible contents of the page. You can kind of think of the body as the physical canvas itself. Everything the user actually interacts with, the text, the embedded videos, the forms, is painted directly onto this specific canvas. Inside our example's body, we have two very straightforward elements, H1, which defines a large primary heading, perfect for your main title, and P, which defines a standard paragraph of text. By keeping the visible stuff inside the body and the metadata inside the head, HTML maintains a brilliantly clean separation of duties. Okay, section 3, understanding HTML elements. So, an HTML element is usually defined by a very specific triad, a start tag, some content in the middle, and an end tag. Notice the syntax here. The start tag is just the tag name wrapped in angled brackets. But the end tag, it has one absolutely crucial difference: that / right before the tag name. That slash is the definitive signal to the browser that this specific element is officially closed. If you forget that slash, the browser will just assume everything that follows is still part of that initial element, which can cascade and totally break your layout. No fun at all. Looking at how this formula works in practice, on the top row, we open with our h1 start tag, insert our content, my first heading, and then close it with the h1 end tag, complete with that vital /. We do the exact same thing on the next row for our paragraph using the p tags. The HTML element itself is considered to be everything from that start tag all the way through to the end tag. It basically wraps the content up completely, boxing it neatly so the browser knows exactly where the element begins and where it ends. But hey, just as soon as we establish a rigid rule, there's always got to be an exception, right? Enter the lone wolf of HTML tags, the BR tag, which stands for line break. This is what developers refer to as an empty element or a void element, because as you can see, it has absolutely no content inside of it and it requires no end tag whatsoever. It just stands entirely on its own to force a simple visual line break on the page. It's a really great reminder that while HTML is a highly structured language, it's also wonderfully pragmatic. It was designed to handle the nuanced, sometimes messy reality of actually rendering text on a screen. Let's move into our final section, Section 4, the history of HTML. Since the very early days of the World Wide Web, HTML has been a living, breathing standard. I mean, just look at the sheer volume of updates and recommendations over the decades. It really reflects a constant game of catch-up. As what we wanted shifted from simple academic text documents to dynamic media-rich applications, the underlying markup language had to dramatically adapt. The web is just an inherently fluid environment, constantly pushing the boundaries of what browsers can handle. Every single time new hardware capabilities or user experience trends pop up, HTML has been forced to evolve right alongside them to make sure the web stays a robust platform for all of us. Tracing the major leaps here is honestly fascinating. Back in 1989, Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, and just 2 years later in 1991, he published the very first description of HTML. By 1995, they had formalized HTML 2.0. But what happened between those early days and the modern era? Well, it was essentially a digital battlefield. The late 90s and early 2000s were defined by these infamous browser wars, where massive tech companies were just rapidly introducing their own non-standard tags to try and lock developers into their specific ecosystems. It literally threatened the universality that made the web great in the first place. It took years of intense debate to pull the web back toward a unified standard, culminating in 2012 when HTML5 was officially designated as a living standard. That monumental shift meant HTML would be continuously updated moving forward rather than released in fragmented versions. It ended those browser wars for good and successfully set the stage for the deeply interactive modern web we build on today. From a relatively simple set of tags invented back in 1991 to the highly complex, living standard that powers our modern digital world, HTML truly is the incredible blueprint of the web. By understanding how to properly wrap your content in the right descriptive tags, you're giving browsers the exact semantic instructions they need to render everything flawlessly. But technology never stops moving. So I'll leave you with this. Now that you understand the blueprint of the past and the present, how do you think these foundational tags will continue to evolve to build the spatial, immersive, or AI-driven web of our future? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time as we continue to decode the architectures around us.